Welcome to Bring Out Your Badass Self, a movement to break your negative thoughts and habits and instead focus on building each other up and encouraging fearless authenticity.
Each week, we will get vulnerable and share experiences alongside our guests and audience. Come rediscover your inner badass self. Get ready to boy bass!
Good morning. Good morning, Kate.
Morning, Sarah. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Yeah.
How are you doing this morning?
I am great. I am ready to fuel my Friday.
Oh, yeah. Fuel it, baby.
Yes, I'm fueling it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
If you are just joining us, please let us know that you are here. Just give us a quick hello. We would love to hear from you. And also, just as a reminder for those on Facebook, we do need your permission to be able to see your name. So be sure to go to StreamYard.com/Facebook and give us permission for StreamYard to see your lovely name.
Oh,
good morning,
you.
Renee.
Good morning.
I love her glasses too. Yeah, she just got them back.
Or yes. They're new. Yeah, they are new. Slightly more cat-eyed than my last ones.
Yeah.
So it is nice to be able to see. I was wearing old glasses for a couple of weeks, and that's always tough. You know.
It is. Hey, good morning, Kelly.
Good morning, Kelly.
She said, long time no see. She actually just left the cabin yesterday. So
awesome.
She was here for a brief moment. And so, yes, so you might notice I'm in a different spot today.
Right. I was going to say, tell us about the bed behind you, the glory.
Oh. Yeah, so I'm up on the second floor. I had to kick out my guests. I was like, by the way, I have to do a show, so I'll need your bedroom because it really is. I need to be away from everyone else.
Right.
So I'm actually up in McKaysville, Georgia, which is where our cabin is located up north. Cate has been here. Definitely a whole show in itself to tell that story.
Yes. Good morning, Kim.
Good morning, Kim. Yes, we're happy to see you too.
I was not aware that your maiden name is Broadnax. That is an interesting maiden name. I want to talk more about that someday, Kim.
And we have our other shirts today. We're wearing gray.
I love your little crisscross thing.
Yeah. I decided to do something a little different with you.
Yes. Oh, they're so comfy.
They are. Hey, good morning, Teresa.
Morning, Teresa.
Yeah, so Amanda McLean, who is the person that created the shirts, she's actually here with me and with her family.
She's the guest you kicked out, right?
Yeah, she's the guest I kicked out of this bedroom, her and her husband. And so her and her kids are here with us at the cabin. It's spring break for our school. So
good morning, Steph. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, welcome to our 4th episode of Boy Bass, Bring Out Your Badass Self. And today's topic is establishing boundaries versus expectations. And today we're going to discuss what boundaries are and what they aren't, as well as discuss different types of boundaries, why boundaries are integral to a healthy relationship. And we're going to be sharing some personal examples of boundary setting today. So Cate and I are really going to be talking about real life examples that we have dealt with.
Yes.
Yeah, Teresa, she said she could have joined me live. So we might have her make an appearance. Who knows? Maybe she'll come on up. And so for today's inspiration, we do have a song today. I actually gave Brock a week off, and so I was actually able to get some piano music, do this particular one. But Cate, this song is a little bit interesting to team up with boundaries, because my hope is that people wouldn't get to this point in a song. And so it's Call Me When You're Sober. Hopefully people are not going to get to a point of having to establish a boundary when people are continuously overstepping it like that. So I'm excited about this particular song. She ends up talking, if you listen in there to the lyrics, it talks about expectations. It also talks about a boundary setting, which is really the topic we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear it.
All right, let's get going. Let's play this.
Should I let you fall, lose it all, so maybe you can remember yourself? Can't keep believing we're only deceiving ourselves, and I'm sick of the lie, and you're too late. Don't cry to me. If you loved me, you would be here with me. You want me, come find me, make up your mind. There you
Lovely. Thank you.
I'll be glad when Brock's back next week.
Yeah, well, everybody has to have a spring break.
I know, exactly.
Well, I think it was great, and the whole rest of the song is about setting boundaries, and expectations, but it really seems to be about a relationship where one person is only trying to interact when they are not sober.
Yeah.
Right. And
and isn't that the truth in most of the time when you're trying to set a boundary? A lot of times the other person sometimes doesn't even recognize. And so it's like, how do you, I think the biggest challenge that people have is, how do you set a boundary when the other person doesn't recognize it? And so that's what we're going to talk about, that you really need the other person to set a boundary. And I think that's why people sometimes struggle, because they're like, well, doesn't this person have to adhere to what it is that I'm telling them they have to do?
Yeah. Right.
And so that's what they struggle with. And so.
Yeah. Right. That makes
so let's talk about, I think it's important for us to start off talking about expectations, because I think a lot of times people get boundaries and expectations confused. So maybe if we can spend a little time talking about expectations. So
yeah, definitely.
What are your thoughts on what an expectation is?
So I think the key difference is the expectation is that you have is really about the outcome of an event or an action, right? Mm-hmm. So you're hoping for this to be the end result. Where a boundary is different because it's a limit. It's more proactive. You're trying to prevent an outcome, right? Yeah. You're trying to protect yourself and put up a limit to prevent something else from happening. And I just wanted to say I love Carmen's good morning, my fellow badasses. Good morning, Carmen.
Good morning, Carmen. Yeah, expectations. For me, they're what I would want or desire potentially from someone. And when we place expectations on others, we are also telling ourselves and the other person, this must happen, when in actuality, that isn't the expectation is on the person. For me, where a boundary is on me. And so I think a lot of times people need to separate the two and understand a boundary is about what you are going to do. how you're going to control yourself in this situation, and also establishing what you will and won't tolerate. And even in our business, like we ask people, like, what are your expectations regarding this particular project? And
Right.
so an expectation is understanding what your desire is, what your
Right.
need, what your want. But then sometimes we have to say, well, those don't come in alignment.
Right.
And then we have to figure out, how do we get those in alignment? Or sometimes we never get there.
Yep. I can think of it. I know a boundary is definitely internal, right? And you can kind of think of expectations as external,
Oh,
in a lot of ways, right? Because it is
yeah.
about the outcome,
Yeah. And boundaries is about the space needed between you and others to ensure you are also protecting your well-being. That is
Right.
ultimately for me, what a boundary is. It's about protecting yourself and the things that you need in your life, but it's you making the choice between those. Whatever the action is, it's you taking the action in how you're going to establish that boundary.
Yep.
Yeah. And so
That's kind of how they're different.
yeah. And so the difference for me in boundaries is to keep us safe. It's much like a physical boundary. Expectations gives no property lines to one another. So it's not like, here's where the boundary is, and then here's what I'm going to do if this particular boundary is overstepped. If you overstep, think about even like physical property. Like if someone steps onto your yard, well, if you step onto my yard, I'm going to call the police. That you're establishing what it is that's going to happen.
Yeah. And like every action has a consequence, right? So and whether that's a good consequence or a bad consequence, so that is an important part of the difference between a boundary and anything else, is that you've decided ahead of time what the consequence is for that,
right?
If that boundary gets crossed.
Yeah. But keep in mind, the consequence is, it's not necessarily against the other person. It's just like, here's what I'm going to do if this boundary continues to get crossed. So it's not like against someone. We're not trying to coerce or manipulate anybody else.
Right.
We're just saying, this is what I will, need to do. And we'll get into some specific examples today.
Right. It doesn't necessarily have to be like, them is fighting words. It's not you cross my boundary and I'm going to attack. Out, it is more, like, this is what I have to do for myself.
Yep.
So, I know that if this boundary gets crossed, I need to do this,
right.
And in a way, you're coping ahead for a situation that puts you in a bad place, right? That's what a boundary is.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, as I was doing further research, even on this topic and things like this is one of the things I think I'm really good at, is establishing boundaries. I'm not always the best, but I feel like I'm pretty good at doing this. I've had to learn over the years how to do this. But one of the things that when I was researching it was talking about the different reasons of the importance of a boundary setting. And one of the key things has to do with valuing ourselves. And I think so many times people don't really put themselves first. They're always that people pleaser is one that allows boundaries to overstep them. But it's also one of the other things that it said is that you really should have stronger boundaries put in place, because you can always relax the boundaries versus trying to tighten them up. Like if someone starts to overstep, it's harder to make it stronger because you didn't establish the good boundaries from the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And that thing about valuing yourself, right? Like, what you said, like a boundary is really about, how you want to protect yourself. It's interesting to point out, or it's a good thing to think about, is if there are people in your life that are consistently crossing boundaries, it's likely because they don't value them. It's not necessarily because they want to piss you off. it's likely because they don't get it. They don't value it. They don't know how to do it for themselves. So why would they, do it for you? I love Teresa's comment though, that get off my lawn.
Yeah. And when we don't set boundaries, we're really prioritizing someone else's needs over ourselves and at our own expense.
Right. And but it's not prioritizing their actual needs most of the times. It's our perception of what their needs are, which are most likely derived from our fear or anxiety around the entire situation, right?
Yep.
So that's an important aspect to think about. Well, and we'll get more into it.
So what are some of the other important things for people to keep in mind regarding setting boundaries?
But I think one of the most important things, and we've talked about this in the past, is, your boundary has to really be derived from your core values, right? Like the things that are the most important to you. That should be your guidance in terms of, how you set your limits up that protect yourself.
Yep. And we're going to see more of that today as we get into types of boundaries as well. For me, it's also, you are ultimately teaching someone how to treat you.
Yes.
And so when you establish what your boundaries are or what it is that you will accept or not accept, you are ultimately, every time you're talking to someone, you're telling them how it is they can and can't treat you.
Yes.
And so think about, and we're in the business world. So think about every time you start a project, and if you're constantly seeing someone overstepping boundaries, like they're always going outside of the scope, or they feel like they can do certain things with you, what is it that you're maybe not doing at the beginning to establish, like, here's the, what, and it's expectations, it's establishing expectations. But on top of that, you're then saying, okay, but now when it gets to this point, this is when we will, it's like those exclusions and the things that we won't do that are so important in contracts, for example. It's the same thing in your personal life as well. Like, here's where I won't go any further than this, and then this is what I will do in those types of situations.
Yeah, definitely. I think look at Stephanie's comment right there. By setting boundaries, not only are you protecting yourself, but you're protecting the relationship. That is so key. It's just what Sarah said. That happens in most contracts have protections for both parties, right? But in the personal space, you're encouraging a more healthy relationship with the person involved.
And the one thing that I really learned about boundaries is that healthy relationships have boundaries. And what that means is that if you care for each other, you will want to know where it is someone would feel uncomfortable or upset. And so you would want to understand where their boundaries are. Otherwise, you may not care. If you don't care about people's boundaries, do you really care about that person? And sometimes, you have people outside the world and you're like, I don't care, what that person thinks. But in healthy relationships, like with your family, people you work with, the people, extended friends, things like that, you want to understand what their boundaries are, because that is a healthy relationship. So I think a lot of times people think boundaries are bad. Like, oh, I feel so guilty for setting this boundary for myself. And I'm like, why? I'm like, just, this is what you need to be happy and to be able to take care of yourself. And so when you start to think of it in that mindset of you're really doing it for your sanity, for your protection, for your well-being, then it should become much easier.
Yep.
Good morning, Myra.
Good morning.
So anything else importance on boundaries that people should keep in mind?
I mean, most of the time, Sarah, we are talking about, our positive, our, helpful, our loving relationships where the intent there is really positive, right? Most of the time, the people that care about us, their intent isn't to push our boundaries, right? they just don't get it yet, or it hasn't been expressed or communicated. But there are people or things out there that that don't have the best intentions. So by having really good boundaries, you're actually protecting yourself from some of the negative things that can happen, being manipulated or used or drained of your energy and your will to live. Have you ever been drained?
Oh,
like
yeah.
An energy vampire.
Absolutely. And I also think it's important to keep in mind that sometimes loved ones have the best intention on things, but sometimes you know where your limit is. And so when you establish a boundary and someone's not protecting your boundary or they're not respecting your boundary, you then have to determine, okay, look, this is what I'm going to end up doing because I know that I need to protect myself. This is what I'm going to do. And I think a lot of times people think that boundaries mean that we no longer have a relationship and now I want what's bad, I don't want good things for you. And that doesn't have to be the case. You can actually very much love someone, detach from that person for your own sanity and for your need in that moment. It doesn't mean you won't come back together in a relationship. But sometimes you have to do that because the person is not willing to take a look at your boundaries. And so you end up sometimes having to detach from that person or distance yourself from that person. But it doesn't mean that hate has to fill that space. You can still do it in love.
Yes. And I have had moments, and I have where I've watched my friends do this, or this has happened to me, where I had to put up a boundary. So I had a long-term relationship of friendship, and she ended up kind of judging me and putting me and really kind of acting as though and telling me that she wasn't kind of approving of my life choices at the time. And I, tried to very gently say, like, I need you to back off because this is where I'm headed. And if, you either get on board or you don't. And it was clear that, she didn't want to be on board. And I had to put up a boundary. We had to have space. And we ended up taking about 10 years out of our relationship. We didn't talk. We didn't, it took about 10 years until one day she literally saw me and grabbed me and gave me a hug and held onto my shoulders and said, "I am sorry. I'm so sorry I judged you. And I'm so sorry I missed all this time in your life. And what can I do?" And then we were able to sit down together and redefine a relationship.
Yeah.
What are our boundaries? What do we look like now that we're 40 instead of 30, right?
Yeah.
Like how do we continue down this path and have a healthier relationship? And it's been wonderful with this particular friend.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Sometimes just that space and having a little bit of life perspective allows you to be able to understand things a little bit more. But how great of you to be able to set that boundary and say, like, look, this isn't acceptable for me. And if that means losing this friendship, unfortunately, that's what it means. Because and I think that we'll talk about the different types of relationships, but I think in friendships, sometimes it is saying, okay, like, here are things that we just can't talk about. Like,
yes,
sometimes, and even in family members, especially over the past couple of years, with politics and stuff like that, it's like, okay, Thanksgiving, no, we're not going to talk about politics. Like, that is a boundary. Like, we had to establish that in our family. Like, Thanksgiving, no politics speaking.
Right.
Because we love each other, we're going to respect each other.
Right. We don't all align. Why go down this path and toss it all out there? What is the point of that? Because
it never is positive.
Right. So, yeah.
And that's what I've continued to look at. It's like, okay, in this moment is this going to be a positive thing to say this? Or, Thanksgiving boundaries. So true. This is my sister-in-law. It's so, so we were like, not talking about politics. It was actually on both sides. So, it's a funny thing. So let's talk a little bit about types of boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first one being physical.
Yep. Yeah. And this is the boundary that we think of the most, like the get off my lawn, like a real physical parameter that you're setting up, so for me, I don't want to be touched, if you're a fucking stranger, do not touch me.
But Kate, your bald head is just so attractive. I want to just touch it.
Ask, I guess, I don't mind that much, but I do all the time, because I have a tattoo on the back of my head. People think, that's okay, that they should be able to touch it. I had a gentleman in Texas in a gas station touch the back of my head and tell me that someone missed coloring in something, like, no, sir, that is the limit. Please don't touch me.
Yeah. I mean, and I think most people know there are certain physical boundaries, like hitting people, abusing them sexually, any of those types of things, like those are common boundaries that people shouldn't be overstepping. Right. But physical can also be like, I'm pregnant and people are touching my belly, or people want to touch your hair, or all of those different types of things that are just not acceptable. Like that is consent of touching someone's physical being.
Yes. It happens all the time. And you have to empower your kids too, because this is a huge topic, I think, but
yes,
kids are naturally, I think, when we were growing up and even generations before us, adults could just grab you and kiss you and hug you and do whatever they want to you. Right. And so, I think it's a common thing in parenting this day to empower your kid to know that their body belongs to them. And then, you can teach them to do the same with the people around them. But there's nothing drives Jenna and I more crazy than if, someone just touches our child without asking them first, yes, my daughter has cool hair. Do not touch it. Just because you like it or it's different than yours, do not touch it. That's not okay.
Well, I think even as a parent, one of the things that I had to do with my daughter is she had come to me, this was a couple of years ago, and she ended up telling me she didn't like hugs anymore. Like, I'm not a huggy person, is what she told me. And I was like, okay, just know that this is going to be super hard for mom to not give you a hug, but I am going to respect your boundaries. I'm going to respect your request. And what I would like to do is I would like to ask you, can I give you a hug? And you can then make a decision, yes or no, on whether I can give you a hug. And she was like, okay. And so I would ask her. And that only lasted like 6 months. And now she's like hugging me left and right. And so the fact that I just honored her boundaries, she then decided it wasn't all that important. And now she's a huggy person again.
Yes, exactly. I have another quick story from my childhood. And it kind of, it veers on something a little sad too, around sexual abuse. But my birth mother died when I was 1. And then, so I had this whole side of a group of family that my dad remarried, that I wasn't kind of intimately involved in, but I would see on a annual basis. But because there was some drama when she died, and they were concerned that my dad married too fast and stuff, there was this gap where I didn't see them. And I can kind of remember meeting them, obviously I knew them when I was a baby, but I didn't remember it. So I can remember meeting them, and I remember starting to participate in those family activities. One of the first activities we had, I was meeting an uncle of mine for the first time. And I just instantly didn't like the guy. I just was like, no, just the energy, whatever it was, I was like, my grandmother was upset that I wouldn't hug my uncle. And I just stayed my ground. My parents had taught me that I don't have to do that. So just stayed my ground. I ended up calling my dad and saying, you know what, I'm going to need you to come pick me up because I don't know what's going on with grandma, but she's being really mean and won't, and it's trying to make me hug uncle and I don't want to. He did end up coming to get me. And it turns out that uncle had been sexually abusive and he was aware of it, and I had no clue, but he was it was a great life lesson for me and he made that lesson, very clear. He tied it back. Like, you always have the right to follow your gut.
Yep.
And you don't want to do something, don't do it.
I know.
It's that simple.
And so many times kids feel pressured into doing something because a parent is telling me or an adult is telling me. I say the same thing to my daughter. I'm like, look, you have to follow your gut. Like, when things are right or wrong, or when they feel right or wrong for you. Trusting your instincts, whole other topic. That this is a part of it. You have to be able to know and not feel pressured into doing things that for you, doesn't feel right. And that's part of boundary setting, is not giving into the pressure and doing something against your core values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have any of you experienced things like that? I see Teresa said all the cheek pinching as a kid.
Yes. And so I didn't really deal with that. I was just like, no.
Right. Other types of boundaries, maybe we've given a lot of examples of these already, emotional boundaries, or times when you just need space.
Yep.
A mental boundary. Absolutely. Things that you just won't, you won't hear. Like, you don't want to be name called, or you don't,
Yeah. So if, for example, a lot of times husband and wives or spouses, partners, even people sometimes you work with, maybe someone calls you stupid or calls you a name or something along those lines, and it's something that is unacceptable to you. So how will you go about letting that person know? So as an example, if someone is calling you stupid, or you have someone that's yelling at you or things like that. And I'll give an example of this. I know we were going to talk about this a little bit later, but I think it's a good time. So I had a client of ours that was very emotional. And when I got onto the call with him, he was yelling. And I simply let him know that I said, look, I want to help you. I said, but in order for me to help you, I need for this to be a calm conversation. And it seems like it may not be the right time for us to have this conversation. So if you're able to continue and we're able to talk through this in a calm manner, I'll continue. But otherwise, it seems like we may need to reschedule this meeting. And he just was like, so he calmed down and he started talking to me. He started getting emotional again. And I said, and I had to remind him, I said, I'm willing to continue this conversation. I just want to remind you that this needs to be a calm conversation because I can't help you if you're yelling at me. And he calmed back down and we worked through it. But that is simply establishing a boundary in the moment that yelling at me is not acceptable. I'm not going to continue this conversation, but I did it in a very, like, you can't yell at me. I didn't say any of those things. It was like, this is what I will deal with. And I'm willing to I'm still willing to have the conversation, but maybe we need to have this at a later time. And so it doesn't have to be a harsh thing to establish a boundary.
Yeah. And for me, it's a little easier in a business situation, right? Because I'm in my work world, I am most often thinking about what is going to be the most effective, right, thing to do in this moment. What's going to get us towards our goal? And so for me, it's a little easier, or it has been historically. I have found in my personal life. So one of the things that you did in the first, in your example, the first way that you expressed it to him, it was a very we need to be calm. we can't be raising our voices, right?
Right.
And then later you switched it to I, but never were you like, hey, you're being an asshole. Don't yell at me.
Well,
right?
That's what I wanted to say, but
Right. Right. But we do that in our personal life, right? Once in a while,
Mhm.
like, especially if our emotions are heightened, if somebody does something, I'd be like, why are you yelling? You know, like that's what you want to say to them. Like, why are you doing this to me? But in reality, it's that just most often like feels offensive or attacking, you know. What can be more effective is if you make it about you, you know. So like I have effectively done that when I say like I can't think right now,
Mhm.
you know, or I can't even understand what I'm going through or what I need to process in this moment, so I need space. Not, you know, you're clearly, you know, dysregulated and you're being mean to me. That person's already dysregulated and they most likely don't want to be mean to you. They're just in a bad space in that moment.
Right.
And I found it as much easier if I make the situation about me, take the space, and then, you know, I'm able to come back.
Yeah. Agreed. I think one of the other types of boundaries that a lot of times we don't respect for ourselves is time.
Oh, yeah.
And so, an example of this would be whenever I get off in the evening time with my husband, you know, with from work.
Mm-hmm.
I work from home, so I'm immediately walking into the living room, and my husband has had his downtime already, and he's moving on. He's doing other things, you know, and he's like, "I need you to do this. I need you to, you know, come do this." And I'm like, "Okay."
He needs his sous chef, right?
He needs a sous chef. And I'm like, I hear you. I know you need me to help you with these things. If you can give me just a moment, I need some downtime. I haven't had any downtime from coming to here to here. And he's like, you're right. I'm sorry. You know, go ahead, spend some time. And so I get a little bit of time to decompress. So it's just asking for it. Most of the time, people are like, think that they don't deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't even ask for it.
Yep. Right. Yeah. In my personal life, it took me a long time to understand that it was okay for me to say, this is just not a great time for me.
Right.
This is not a great time of the day for me to engage in these types of activities. So it was about time protecting, you know, like just because it's a great time for you. So like, you know, Jay's cooking and he's engaged in that activity. He wants to pull you in immediately.
Yep.
You know, it's the same as like my kids, you know, sometimes they are all wound up and excited about something at 9 o'clock at night. And I'm ending my day. Like my life is over at 9 o'clock at night, you know, like I can't possibly have the level of conversation that you want to have right now. That doesn't mean I'm not interested. That doesn't mean I don't care. You know, we just have to find a time that's right for both of us. You know?
Yeah.
And
You know,
same thing when I wake them up in the morning, I had to kind of understand that I couldn't come in guns a-blazing and expect them to be as high energy as I am. You know, I've been awake for 6 hours working.
Let's go.
Yeah, let's go. All right. What are you doing?
So I think a couple of others we probably won't get into deeply, but maybe if we can just touch upon them.
Yeah.
So there's also financial and material boundaries. So sometimes it might be when you're first starting a relationship and financially you have separate money. Like this is how we will handle paying for the bills or things like that. So it's establishing even with each other the expectations and then what you will and won't do. Like if you feel like you're paying a little bit more than you really should be, you know, a part of the relationship, or figuring out whether it's just going to all go into a pile and you're all just going to pay everything. So where do your boundaries lie from a financial or material perspective?
Definitely. That's an important one. That comes into play too when you're doing, you know, a lot of group activities sometimes and friends.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like everybody's level of income is different sometimes.
I think that's huge. And sometimes people are very disrespectful when it comes to those types of things.
Mhm.
Like if I'm going to have someone go with me that doesn't necessarily make as much money as I do, I try to not put them in a position where they're having to pay for a $700 a night hotel room.
Right.
I'm looking at something that's more reasonable. And I've seen those types of situations where it's like, wow, you're really putting that person in a weird situation by not thinking about what it is they can and can't do with their finances.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an important aspect. I think another type of boundary, there are like spiritual or religious boundaries that some people have, that
Yep.
you need to kind of outline and sometimes communicate.
Absolutely. And I think that this is one of the areas that a lot of times people, it's interesting. A lot of times people think, well, this is my belief, so everybody else should have this belief. Well, if you're really respecting boundaries, boundaries are about you. It's like, okay, here's where my boundary is related to my spiritual or religious belief. That's not pushing it onto you. It's just saying what isn't acceptable whenever I take the action. I think
Right.
the key thing people have to understand is you're not controlling someone else. You're controlling yourself. You're controlling what you will and won't do, not telling someone else what they will and won't do. And if
Mhm.
anything, boundaries allow more flexibility for everybody to be who they are and determine when they are uncomfortable or when they're in a place that doesn't feel good for them.
Right. Yep. Without a doubt.
The next one is sexual boundaries. I think that this is also super important. It's something I do on the side as well. I have a group on Facebook that's called Sex Positive. And having gone through abuse or been molested whenever I was young, it was one of the things that I had to relearn.
Mhm.
Boundaries related to sex. And also it had to do with valuing yourself and then establishing what those boundaries are. But there's physical, there's emotional, there's mental, and these days there's even digital. Like when you are dealing with, think about people as they're growing up and they're sexting or they're sending photos or things like that. Like you have to establish a boundary of, if I send this to you, here's my expectation. And then what will you do if that person oversteps that boundary?
Right. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole topic in itself.
Mm-hmm. What'd you say?
I said, that's a whole topic in itself.
Yes. Oh yeah, definitely. We could go down that path.
Yep.
Yeah, without a doubt. There's also then, I think that there's an overarching kind of category of boundaries that can be any of the ones we mentioned, but these are like the deal breakers. These are the deal breaker boundaries. These are like, this is so important to me that, I can't allow it. I would say for me, I'm willing to respect other people's religious beliefs or beliefs around lifestyle or things. But for me, I can't, like, if you just hate my lesbian same-sex family lifestyle, if you that's okay, but I can't put energy into a relationship like that, because that's a huge part of who I am.
Right.
That is my family. That is that's me. So I that's a deal breaker for me. Like, if this scares you, we can't be friends. You know?
Exactly. You can't really change the core essence of who you are.
Right.
And that's ultimately what boundary setting is. But Cate and I like to cuss. Can we curb that whenever we need to? And, someone didn't like cussing. Yes, that is something you could do to be respectful and to respect someone else's boundaries. Like, hey, we just don't cuss around our kids. And it was funny, whenever they came, my husband's a little more strict than I am around my kids. I don't really care. I just tell her, look, there are certain places you can do it, certain places you can't. Around me, don't have a problem. Don't do it around dad. He doesn't like it. And so it's teaching her. And I said, you got to be careful because sometimes it might just come out and then you might get yourself in trouble. So just, understand that. And Cate and I have a similar philosophy, but my husband has a different philosophy. And so I'm just like, around him, you can't do it.
Right.
So that's a boundary.
He doesn't want to hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about people that are wanting to start to establish boundaries. What are some of the things that they might deal with when first starting to establish a boundary?
So at first, it's going to be super uncomfortable. It's just like anything else. You got to practice it. So I have a relationship with my nephew, and he's an addict, and I very much understand what he's going through because I myself have struggled with addiction. So I have a hard time. I had a hard time setting some boundaries with him, and it was super uncomfortable. And I had to get some backup. I had to get some help from Jenna to really get some clarity around it. And at the end of the day, the reason why I wasn't able to set the boundary was because I was so scared. I was so scared to lose him. I was scared to not have his confidence, to not have him telling me the truth about the things he was doing. And my fear led me to not wanting to put up that boundary. Yep. So I had to get real uncomfortable. I had to be okay. I had to acknowledge that the fear was there. I had to get uncomfortable in order to do it. Even though I was doubting myself or feeling guilty. Right. So that's a lot of it.
Well, and a lot of times people avoid boundary setting because of the biggest reason is fear. Because when you really think about the types of boundaries you might end up setting, a lot of times it's, well, I'm scared. I'm fearful that this person might get mad at me. I'm fearful that I might ruin this relationship. I'm fearful that I might be alone. So think about all of the reasons that you don't set boundaries is really most of the time because of fear, or sometimes it's also because of what you were saying. It's that self-doubt as well as feeling guilty about even setting them. Like sometimes we even start to question ourselves. Am I being too harsh? Is it really that bad? Or no one else seems to really have an issue with this. And so we start to second guess ourselves instead of having that self-awareness of where your boundaries are, having the confidence to say, no, this is where my boundary is.
Right.
And one of the things that I have found with the guilt that sometimes people feel when setting a boundary is an unearned guilt. And unearned guilt is really that feeling we get when we take an action that breaks an irrational moral standard.
Right. So you can have this irrational moral standard that because, like if I go back to my example with my nephew, because I know what he's going through, I felt guilty about setting a boundary related to it. That's an unearned guilt. That's not my fault. That knowing what he's going through is helpful in my relationship with him, but that doesn't mean that I have to give where I can't give, or that doesn't mean that I'm not prioritizing something else above his needs or desires. Right.
I think sometimes at the beginning, it can even hurt sometimes to even set a boundary for people. They're like, but I feel this way. This feels weird. And sometimes it's because people feel like they're being selfish in doing things. And they're like, but if I do this, they're thinking about the other person versus like, okay, well, what is it that I need in my life? I deserve happiness. I deserve to feel respected. I deserve all of these things. So whenever you are devaluing yourself, you then are allowing other people to step over and step on top of your boundaries.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. At the end of the day, what's really happening is you don't feel worthy of that boundary. So you're not setting it. And you've talked yourself into feeling like something else is more important than how you're really being affected. So by its very nature, boundaries are self-centered, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you don't care.
Right. And setting boundaries can be done in kindness and in love.
Yes.
And so that really is done through first self-awareness, like I said, that we need to feel safe and supported. It also takes a little bit of maturity to allow people to be who they are while being who you are and establishing what you need and what you don't need. And then it really requires confidence in knowing that what you need and expressing those needs in what you're wanting. And we sometimes don't allow ourselves, or even those that surround us, we don't hold them accountable and ourselves accountable for our own standards. And when we don't do that, our relationship really suffers because we're not establishing and understanding what that person needs and what I need.
Yep. Yeah, that goes back to Stephanie's comment. You're protecting the relationship too. And that is, for me, tactically, and how to execute a boundary, that has been really key in my learning how to do this and how to do this well, is to remember that it is about the entire relationship. So because I'm a nurturer, right? I naturally want to take care of people, and it's my instinct is to look at what's possible and to look at things with empathy and to say, well, Cate, you're strong. You can handle that.
Right.
So just go ahead and give them what they need. But at the end of the day, I'm not really able to be what I want to be for that person if I'm not protecting myself, right? So that is the way that I do it with love and kindness, is I make it about the relationship itself.
Yes.
So, in the work situation, we can't be effective. We have found that we can't be effective if we don't follow this process.
Yes.
So even though other options are possible, that doesn't mean that it's the right one for us in this moment, because we can't go into this thinking it's not going to be effective.
Right. Exactly. And so, Cate, let's talk a little bit about, we have about 8 minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about what are healthy boundaries. When we're thinking about examples that we have dealt with, or things that we can say yes to or no to that are examples of setting boundaries, or even just signs of healthy boundaries. I mean, I can think of one right off the bat that I had this week with a client. And this particular client, I went back and forth, and they had a particular way that they wanted things to happen. But for us, we couldn't provide them what they were asking for, because we had to do step 1 before we did step 2. And they wanted us to just start with step 2. And so I was trying to work with this individual and say, look, we can do this part to, a smaller portion of step 1 in order to get to step 2. So I was trying to work with this person, but ultimately it came down to this person wanted it the way they wanted it. So I simply said, look, it sounds like you have a particular way that you're wanting things to happen. We also have a way that we need things to happen in order for us to be successful and to be able to be successful for you. It sounds like we may not get into an alignment, and therefore I'm willing to find someone else and refer you to someone else to see if that person can help you with what it is you're looking for. But I basically had to take away, like, I'm at a point, I've tried everything I can. We've gone back and forth 9 times at this point, and so I'm like, I'm ultimately done. Like, but
the line has been crossed.
We're not in alignment, and it doesn't seem like we're going to get there, but here's how else I can help you. I can connect you to someone else. And then the person came back and was like, all right, let's move forward.
Right. Yes.
I was like, oh my gosh, seriously.
Right.
But you have to know what it is you can and can't do in your job and also in your personal life,
Right.
and what you can deal with. And I think that it's also super important that you can't expect everyone to be at that same level. Like some people are dealing with anxiety issues or dealing with other things, and their level of sometimes boundaries or tolerance of what they can handle is different than someone else.
And it can change in moment to moment, right?
Yeah.
So that was a big thing that I had to learn how to do. I had to, because of just the different things that happened in my life and the ways that my feelings were reinforced in my environment. I had a real lack of awareness around what my emotions were. I was either happy or not. Like there wasn't really much in between. And I had to recognize that when that came into play whenever I was in a conflict in my personal life. So whenever I was in a conflict in my personal life, I just wanted so badly to get back to the happy that I would work so hard to resolve something that I was pushing my own limit of what I was capable of, right? When I'm in the middle of a conflict, if my emotions become really high and dysregulated, nothing else is going to get done. I become completely irrational. Fear takes over. I catastrophize everything. So I have to set a boundary for myself that, you know what, you want to problem solve this? You don't have the skills right now. You're just not capable of it in this moment. So you have to do something different instead of continuing to beat this dead horse where it's going nowhere. You need some space from it. So I think one of the signs of having really established healthy boundaries in your life is awareness and knowing who you are and knowing, what you can tolerate and how you're going to express it and tactically what you're going to do when you're in those scenarios. And there's nothing wrong with practicing those things and kind of coping ahead to know like, okay, the next time, like this is the pattern my partner and I have. The next time we get into this pattern, this is what I'm going to do to attempt to do differently to avoid some outcome.
Yeah. And it reminds me of a situation that a lot of times people have an expectation of their partner as well. It reminds me of not expecting people to read your mind. Boundaries have to be communicated. And I think that is super important to establish, is that you are responsible for communicating what your boundaries are. Don't expect someone to read your mind in what it is that you're expecting. And I'll give you an example with my husband. Just loves it when I talk about him on my show. And so with my husband, he is not the most empathetic person. And so whenever I'm sick or things like that, I let him know like, hey, I'm needing some empathy right now. And all of a sudden he clicks and he's like, oh, I need to like change my mode, because that's what I'm desiring, what I'm asking for. And so a lot of times people just expect that their spouse, you should know me by now. You should know that I need help with the dishes or I need, help with blah, 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 whatever it is. No, ask the person like, hey, I really would appreciate it if you did this. And then boundaries are, well, if this person's going to continue to not help you, and you've expressed, then what would your boundary be in not feeling like you're not being appreciated,
right?
In whatever the situation is.
Right. And it's so interesting because like when we are in our most intimate relationships, we almost can read someone else's mind, right? So it's confusing because it's like, well, I do know what she or he is thinking most of the time, or I feel like I do. Why can't I in this scenario?
Yeah. And so Renee said I was going to comment on don't expect people to read your mind.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. And if you find that you are mind reading, that's a good clue to say, hey, this is what I think is going on for you. I don't want to make up a boundary for you that actually doesn't exist. So, help me help you.
Yeah.
Type of a scenario, right?
And whenever I think about healthy boundaries or signs of a healthy boundary, for me, it's one, being able to respect other people's boundaries.
Mhm.
Two, not feeling guilty for saying no. And I know that everybody that I talk to, I'll say no is a complete sentence. Like, you don't even have to really give people a reason. If you're saying no, you're saying no.
Right.
And that is a boundary. No,
Right.
but you can be nice about it. Like, no, it's not a good time for me, or whatever it might be.
Yep. Yep, without a doubt. And then the only thing I would add on, because I know we're out of time here, is safety. So
Yes.
emotional safety, physical safety. You are in a healthy relationship or a healthy boundary, or have healthy boundaries in that relationship. If you feel safe to not only exist, but safe to express, safe to be vulnerable, safe to say, this is my boundary, and this has changed, so safety is huge too.
Yeah. And you don't need to agree with the other person. When it comes to boundaries, they can have their own belief. You can have your own belief, and you can still establish, this is how I'm, it sounds like we're not going to come into alignment. Maybe we should stop talking about this particular topic instead of continuing on. That is simply a boundary in itself.
Yeah.
Deciding not to talk about it anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. Boundaries for me are just super important for people to be able to establish. It really is allowing you to be able to, one, validate yourself and validate your feelings, and also feeling as if you have the right to say no, to establish the things that you need for your well-being and for your happiness. That's for me ultimately what boundaries are about.
Yep, without a doubt.
Yeah. Okay, we go through this so quickly, or it feels, an hour goes by so quickly for us. I feel like we could talk about this particular topic for days, not just hours. And so let me see what real quick. Stephanie said, also, people sometimes assume that everyone would deal with an issue challenge the same way as they would, and then get angry when it doesn't happen. Everyone is different in how they handle things.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I mean, that comes into play with any emotion, grief, or all emotions. Everybody handles it differently. But when you're problem solving a challenge, you have to remember exactly, what Stephanie said, is that not everyone is going to approach it from the same place.
Yeah. And I would love it, as people are watching this on replay or those that have joined us, is there some type of boundary that you're struggling to set? Maybe we could also ask for examples or assistance in establishing a particular boundary. So let us know if there's something that maybe you did really well in establishing a boundary, or one that you are still struggling with.
Yep. Yeah, I would love to know, guys.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that is the end
That
of
is our show. Feel like we just started, but we already have to go. Please let this and other stuff fuel your Friday. Go out and have a great Friday. Go have a good Friday. It is Good Friday, whether that resonates with you. Yeah. What?
Yeah. I said it is officially Good Friday.
It is officially Good Friday, whether that resonates with you, personally and spiritually or not. Go have one anyway. Fuel your Friday, people. Have a great weekend.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here.
And we would love it if you also share with others to join. We would love to continue to grow BOYBAS and find more badasses out there. So, Cate, thank you so much for the conversation today. I always just love chatting with you about stuff like this.
Me too. I love it as well, Sarah. It makes my Fridays are awesome now. I just love them so much.
That's awesome.
So this has been so much fun. I would do this with you without an audience.
Thank you, guys. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And like Cate said, go out and have yourself a badass Friday.
Yep. Bye, badasses. See you next week.
Bye.